In the center of the wheel, you'll see this cap that covers all the lug nuts with a 22mm socket. Let's remove all these caps that hold onto the lug nuts. Now with the 22mm socket as well, go ahead and take off all 8 of your lug nuts, and then we'll take the wheel off. Next, from the back side, you have 2 18mm bolts, which are also your slider pins. Remove both of those. Leave this one in for now. Take the top one out. Next, we have to compress the pistons on this caliper. It's a dual piston caliper, so I'm using a dual piston caliper depression tool. If you don't have one, well, I'm sure you can make things work with a pair of pliers or something like that. Basically, you want to squeeze these in nice and slow until they're completely compressed, bottomed out up against the back of the caliper. Flip it up on top of the upper control arm. Now we can remove the pads. If you need a pry bar to do this, go ahead and use that. Sometimes they get stuck. And now with a 21mm socket, let's remove these 2 bolts that hold the bracket onto the knuckle. Leave this one in a little bit. Take the bracket off, and now you can take your rotor off. At this point, I want to clean up the hub surface. This one's in pretty good condition, but I still want to make it better. Obviously, you don't want any of these raised areas here, because then the rotor won't sit flush and you're going to have issues going down the road. So you can take a wire brush if yours isn't severe like mine. I'm just going to go around with the wire brush and brush it all off. Or if you need to sand it, go ahead and take a sanding disc to it and clean it up to make it nice and flat. Let's rinse it down with some brake parts cleaner. Now apply a thin coating of anti-seize all over the surface of the hub. Try not to get it on the lug studs, but this will prevent rust from building up in the future, and it'll prevent the rotor from sticking for the next brake job. Now with the hub coated, I'm going to put the rotor on backwards. That way I can clean this surface here with some brake parts cleaner on a rag. You want to get all the oils off that they put so that the rotor doesn't rust on the shelf, and you don't want those getting on your brake pads. Now take it and flip it around, install it the right way, and of course clean up this surface as well. So here's our caliper bracket with the 2 sliders. We'll clean those up in a minute. For now, let's get the bracket prepared. I'm going to take these off, the anti-rattle clips. You can just pry these off. Do that on both sides. And now we have to clean this area where they sit. To do that, you can use a wire brush and brush off all of the rust or rot if you have any rot. If you have to sand it, go ahead and sand it down, but you want these to sit down smoothly. I'm actually going to take a little sanding disc and just sand these down lightly until they're nice and clean. Now take a little bit of brake grease and apply a thin layer along where we cleaned. That's going to prevent further rust from building up, and that's what you want. If you don't clean up this area well and if rust builds up, what happens is the pads get squished between the bottom and the top, and the caliper will overpower this pressure and it'll squeeze the pads onto your rotor, but then when you let go of the brake pedal, the pads won't retract. So that's where you'll have issues. The brakes will kind of get stuck when you try to release them. Now take your anti-rattle clips and press those on. Make sure they're centered. The next thing we want to do is clean and lubricate the caliper slider bore. Mine is actually somewhat clean, it just needs new grease. So what I'm going to do is take a little blob of grease and pack it in there. You can't put a whole lot on the slider because when you go to put the slider through the caliper to tighten it, it's going to wipe off most of it. So that's why I put a lot in there, and I'm just going to put a very thin coating on this. And these, you want to clean up this ridge over here. See how it has some rust? That's going to prevent it from sealing up 100%, and you'll get water in here, and then you'll get rust. You also want to clean up the threads because that's a good idea so they can lock in tight. And you can do that with a wire brush, or if this is not too bad, you can just wipe it off. But I'm going to go over to my wire wheel and clean them up nice. I cleaned up the threads in the ridge here. The rest of it you can just wipe off with a rag. If you have a lot of rot, maybe consider replacing them, but these are in good condition. So obviously we can't put them in yet because they have to go through the caliper, but let's do the same thing to this side and then we will continue. So go ahead and insert some grease in there, and like I mentioned before, if you have rust in here, you want to take a bore brush and clean these out, but I don't. I just have old grease, so I'm just going to add to it. All right, let's mount this bracket onto the vehicle. Now I have a new caliper and bracket, but of course everything you see from this point on will apply to old caliper and bracket as well. Grab your bracket, line up the bolt holes, and start in the bolts. That way you can at least let go after you start in the first one. Okay, let's thread them on. Let's snug them up and then torque them to 221 foot-pounds. I put some red thread locker on these threads. If you're gonna put anything, put thread locker, not grease or anti-seize. And that's 2. Grab your pads and slide them onto the caliper bracket. Make sure that they seat themselves properly. Just like this. You should not need a lot of force to put them on. If you need a lot of force, it means the anti-rattle clips are not sitting flush. Now I'm going to take my caliper, slide it over the pads, over the bracket, position it, make sure the boots are not getting pinched or crushed. I greased up the slider pins, and I'm going to go ahead and push those in all the way. Torque these to 80 foot-pounds. Let's get the wheel back on. Start on all of your lug nuts, bottom them out, and then torque them to 140 foot-pounds. Last but not least, don't forget about the cap that covers up your lug nuts. Slide this on, and it's best to thread this on by hand because these plastic caps can break and strip out easily. So just make them snug enough to hold this in place. You don't have to go crazy tight on these. Okay, take it for a road test.